He's also the former convener of the Moot Court Association and Center for Research in International Law. Also, a lesser known fact about Sankalp sir is that he was the speaker of the first team from NLIU, which broke into the world rounds of the prestigious Jessup Moot. After college, he received scholarship for pursuing the BCL course at the Oxford University. On completing his degree from Oxford, Sir started his career in the field of litigation in Jabalpur and today has a wide spanning practice in various areas of law. In a short span of 12 years, Sir has made a mark at the Madhya Pradesh High Court and today is a renowned name in central India. Before handing over the screen to Sir, I would request all the participants to mute their mics and turn off their videos. Also, if you have any questions during the session, kindly write them in the chat box and I shall convey the same to Sir. I think I shall hand over the screen to Sankalp Sir, if he can take it from here. Sankalp Sir.
Am I audible now? Hello? Yeah. Yeah. Am I audible now? Yeah. So am I audible
Yes, sir,
now?
you're audible. Yes, sir, you're audible.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a very different proposition for me to not look at anybody's face and speak about a topic which has been the sinusoid for the Supreme Court for quite a number of years. And though I've had a lot of interest in academia, I did teach in Oxford as well as NLIU when I was there, particularly my beloved subject, that is criminal law. And that is something which has always intrigued me, particularly the mens rea part of it. And now, because of a lot of technical subjects which have come in, including the terrorist acts, the special protection acts, the National Security Act, there's so many of them where actually the criminal law field has actually widened its horizon. So it's a very difficult proposition not to look at anyone. I don't know how many are there and how many listening to me, but let's take it. As far as the issues are concerned, I don't know. I'll at least like to have somebody on screen, so I feel that I'm speaking to someone, because that is how we do all our video conferencing across the high courts as well as the Supreme Court when we appear for video conferencing and argue matters. So, yeah. So where do we start from? Okay. Now, the first thing first, we can have few people who want to ask their questions as well, and they can unmute their mics if the moderator can assist that and can moderate that. That'll be good, because otherwise it looks like a complete medium where you're speaking to yourself, not having any interaction with anyone. So I don't know how you go about this, and this is something where the professional front, we always speak to each other and there is interaction between all of us when we are doing our video conferences. So I guess that will be a more proper medium where we can have questions where people can put in their questions and comments, and they can directly ask their questions to me. I guess that will be something which would make it more interactive, because I don't want this to be a one-way traffic where I just keep speaking and I don't actually get reactions on what I'm saying. If that is possible, how we intend to go about it, then I can start with the subject.
Sure, sir. The participants can raise their questions directly to you during the session.
Yeah. So if you can just unmute their mics whenever they want to ask some questions, because that is how I think it will be more interactive and will be more informative. Because the topic I'm going to start is something where there are no clear boundaries as to what exactly is culpable homicide amounting to and not amounting to murder. Now, first things first, I'll give you a very practical perspective about what exactly is culpable homicide and how it is different from other sections in the IPC. If I would quote, uh, few of the English authors, and particularly because, as everyone is aware, that this was done in 1872, and Sir James Stephens, he criticized the Indian Penal Code only precisely for Section 299 and 300 and said that this is the weakest part of the code. Though the IPC was made in 1872, and according to Sir James Stephens, the language of Section 299 and Section 300, particularly Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, and Part 4, read with the exceptions to Section 300, is the weakest part of the code because the language of these sections is so intermingled and intertwined that at times it gets very difficult to distinguish between culpable homicide amounting to and not amounting to murder. Now, I'm sure that, when we all appeared for CLAT, we would have studied 299, 300, culpable homicide amounting to, not amounting to murder, the exception to Section 300. And I'm presuming the basic language of Section 299 and 300 has been read by everyone. So I'm not going by the bare act view of what exactly is 299 and 300. And I would like to start off by illustrations to point out that basically the distinction between the two sections is actually blurred. There is no cut and dry method to decide as to when a particular act would amount to or would not amount to murder. Now, the first thing is culpable homicide. What the definition of culpable homicide is very clear under Section 299, which says, and it uses three basic ingredients under Section 299. It says, whoever causes death by doing an act with the intention of causing death. So the first part of Section 299 is the first act is done with the intention of causing death. Second, or with the intention of causing such bodily injury as is likely to cause death. And the third part is, or with the knowledge that he is likely by such act to cause death. Now, the language can be very perplexing, but if you break it down into three parts of Section 299, you would realize that it is on the degree of the act that Section 299 is divided. The first is the highest form, the second is obviously the medium form, and the third is the mildest degree of the act committed by a particular person. The first is whoever causes death. So the precondition for that is that there has to be death. So the first precondition is homicide. The person has to necessarily die, only then you can have culpable homicide. So example, I can shoot in and I can put in 5 bullets in somebody's body. But if that particular person is alive, it's not culpable homicide. That's a given. Culpable, that is intentional. Homicide is death of a human being. So no matter how many injuries you cause to a particular person, if death is not caused, it would never come under Section 299. It can be a case under Section 307, that is attempt to murder. It can be a case of grievous hurt under Section 326. It can be a case of hurt under Section 323. It can be a case under Section 325, but it would never be a case under Section 299 unless death is caused. Now, once death is caused, and death is caused not by accident. See, there can be two kinds of deaths. One is lawful death and the other is unlawful death. What are lawful deaths? Lawful deaths would be something like extermination, where it is ordered by a court. A police officer trying to save somebody and fires at a mob. These are all lawful activities. Soldier killing on the borders. Euthanasia, though it's not accepted in India, but partial passive euthanasia. So these are all lawful forms of death. So there also, culpable means intentional, malicious death of a person would be culpable homicide, not lawful deaths. So there are two preconditions for culpable homicide. One is unlawful death. And second is that it has been done with an intention or knowledge that the act which has been committed by the person would cause death of that particular person. So these are the two preconditions for the elementary satisfaction of Section 299. Now, I'll just put in a question. I don't know how you guys answer this, but this is how we can go forward with how we understand Section 299. Now, if a particular person has been authorized, let's say a police officer is authorized to use rubber bullets just to disperse the mob, and instead of that rubber bullet, he uses actual bullets for disbursement of mobs. Now, whether in that case, he would be committing a lawful or an unlawful act. I'll give you a second illustration. I don't know how you want to answer this, but I'll subsequently give you an answer to this. The second illustration is where a particular person, let's say a doctor, he injects a particular medicine, which is obviously an overdose of that particular medicine, which leads to death of the patient. Whether he has committed culpable homicide in one of the three forms which I just pointed out, that is, whoever causes death by doing an act with the intention of causing death. Second, intention of causing bodily injury as is likely to cause death. Can understand this? So, intention of causing a bodily injury which is likely to cause death, or with knowledge that he is likely by such act to cause death. So there is a possibility where there is overdose of medicine by the doctor, that the doctor, by his special knowledge and particularly in context of his expertise in the medical field, should have knowledge that he is likely by such act to cause death. Now, whether in such a case it would be culpable homicide or it would not be culpable homicide. Now, this is where, because we are now at the very first step of deciding whether a particular act amounts to culpable homicide. Amounting to, not amounting to murder would be a second step. But the first step is, what is culpable homicide? Now, whether in a case of overdose by a doctor, whether it will be a case of culpable homicide, would anyone like to answer this? They can unmute their mic and say.
Hello, sir. This is Rakshit Ranjan.
Hi,
Uh,
Achut.
Sir, in the first case, if the officer who had used actual bullets, sir, am I supposed, sorry, sir, point of inquiry, am I supposed to answer the first illustration or the second one?
Sorry?
Am I to answer the question regarding the first illustration or the
Yes,
second
no,
one?
both of them. Both of them. You can take
Sir, as far as I understand, in the first scenario, it should amount to culpable homicide if the officer was aware of the fact that the bullets he is using are actual bullets and should fall under the third criteria of the definition under 299, where he had knowledge that such acts is likely to cause death, because
Okay.
firing actual bullets in a crowd of people will, under the most probable scenario, cause the death of somebody or more
Okay.
than one person. Whereas in
Okay.
the second case, sir, I don't think it amounts to culpable homicide because this is an act of negligence. There was no actual. The difference between, as far as I understand, that intention and negligence is that he had a duty of care and he failed to take care of it. He didn't know that
Uh-huh.
he is providing an overdose of medicine to that particular patient. So that will not exactly fall under 299 but under 304A.
Okay. Good answer. Good answer. Now, I would just try to make a distinction between the two cases. See, there is no hard and fast rule to decide that whether a particular instance or further a particular category falls under 299, 300 or 304A. As far as the second part where the doctor had given an overdose, it for sure comes under 304 part A, that is rash and negligent act. Now, the only difference is that you cannot confuse between tortious liability, where you're talking about duty of care. In penal code and in the criminal law, there is no concept of duty of care. It is not the case that a professional would be taken up in a different capacity, that is tortious liability. In criminal law, it is pure and simple intention, knowledge, which is attributed to a particular person. Now, since he is a professional, therefore, special knowledge would be attributed to him. It would not be a case, had it been a case of a layman who is not medically trained giving a particular dose of medicine, and it ultimately comes down and results into an overdose, is a separate proposition altogether. Then in that case, it would not be any offense whatsoever. It would not be even causing death by negligence under section 304A. But since it is a case of a professional who is trained in the field, therefore it would fall under section 304A. Now I'll just read 304A and then we'll come to culpable homicide. Why this is important is to understand the degree of intention and knowledge. Now listen to 304A. Whoever causes death of any person by doing any rash or negligent act not amounting to culpable homicide shall be punished with imprisonment of either description for a term which may extend to 2 years. So the distinction in 304A is person by doing any rash or negligent act not amounting to culpable homicide. Now, therefore, the first step is, even for 304A, the first step which has to be seen is whether it is falling under 299 or not. Once it is not culpable homicide, then you would look into whether it is falling under 304A or not. So it is not the case that the first step would be 304A. The first step always would be culpable homicide. So every act where a particular person has died, the test first has to be seen as actus reus, mens rea, and whether it falls under one of the provisions under section 299, the three provisions which we've just read out. That is, whoever causes death by doing an act with the intention of causing death. Second, with the intention of causing such bodily injury as is likely to cause death. And the third is the knowledge that he is likely by such act to cause death. Two intentions. The first is the highest degree of intention. The second is where he is only intending. Now, I'll come to this point now, where we are talking about intention of causing such bodily injury as is likely to cause death. Now, therefore, here what is happening, I'll give you an illustration. A particular person has special knowledge regarding a special disease which is suffered by the victim. Let's say that he has an enlarged spleen, or let's say he has a weak heart, an enlarged heart. Now he has knowledge regarding that particular fact and that specific disability of that particular person. And he, with his full force, punches the heart of that particular victim. Now in that case, he might not have the intention to kill, but he would have that particular knowledge. I'm just reading this. With the intention of causing such bodily injury as is likely to cause death. So he is not intending to kill. He is intending to inflict a particular bodily injury. And that bodily injury is likely to cause death. Now, if the person knows about the special or the specific disability of the victim, it falls under this category. If he is not aware that he is suffering from that particular ailment or disease, and it is a case where there is a case of sudden fight, then in that case, it would not be a case of that particular injury which is likely to cause death. Why? Because in ordinary circumstances, whoever would punch somebody on the chest, the victim would not die. So there are two criteria in this. One is an objective criteria, and the second is a subjective criteria. The subjective criteria is that whether you had that intention of causing that particular bodily injury. And the objective criteria is likely to cause death. When I'm saying likely to cause death, it is in context of whether in all likelihood, if similar injury was suffered by any other person, whether it would cause death or not. So then in that case, the word likely to cause death comes into picture. Same is the case, I'm just transgressing right now. I'm just going to a different topic. Section 300 has 4 parts. If you read the section, the first one deals with brutal intention, where somebody would kill with from a point blank range. But part thirdly is very similar to part 2 of the culpable homicide not amounting to murder. Part 3 of section 300 says where a particular person inflicts a particular bodily injury, and that particular bodily injury is sufficient in the ordinary course of nature to cause death. Now here also there is a subjective criteria and there is an objective criteria. The objective criteria and the subjective criteria are intertwined. I'll give you an example. There is a scuffle between A and B, and both of them are giving each other a blow. And during that scuffle, A yields a lathi or a stick, and that lands on the head of the victim. As a result of that, he dies. Second illustration. B is sitting. A comes from behind, aims at the head of the victim, B, and inflicts that particular bodily injury on his head. In both the cases, there is an injury which is caused on the head. But in the second case, where he is aiming and he is inflicting a particular bodily injury, then only thing which has to be seen then is whether that particular injury which is caused, which is purely a medical evidence issue, whether that particular injury is sufficient in the ordinary course of nature to cause death or not. Meaning thereby, only thing which then has to be seen is whether the force with which that particular blow was inflicted on the body of the victim or the head of the victim, whether that would result in death of any other ordinary man or not. Only this is the test, that injury is sufficient in the ordinary course of nature to cause death. So therefore, The only thing which would have to be seen is whether I had that intention of causing that particular bodily injury. In the first illustration, the person did not have the intention to cause a particular bodily injury, meaning thereby that he did not aim at the head of the victim. It was a scuffle. In the scuffle, he wielded a stick and it landed on the head of the victim. Then in that case, it would not be section 300 part thirdly. But in the second case, it would be section 300 part thirdly. Now, the first act in that case, whether it is culpable homicide or it is not even culpable homicide. Would anyone like to answer this?
Sir, hello, this is Nipunj.
Yeah,
I have an additional question. Since you have been practicing in this field, you know that proving intention is a very difficult task. So, whether an act falls under the second category of Section 300 or the third category of Section 300 totally comes down to medical evidence. Is that right?
See, no.
In such cases where intention cannot be proved.
See, I'll tell you something. It's a good question and it's a very practical one. I don't know how you would be able to appreciate this because this involves a intertwined question of evidence, the procedure, that is CRPC, as well as the IPC. The intention would not be gathered from medical evidence only. The intention would have to be gathered from the attending circumstances. I'll give you a very holistic answer to this. Let's take three different scenarios to gather what intention actually is. The first is an illustration of the case of Nanavati. Everyone is aware what's the Nanavati case? There's so many movies made on that as well. Where
yes,
the defense which was taken was that the accused saw his wife in a compromising state with the deceased. And there he was provoked in grave sudden provocation. He fired gunshot at his wife as well as the lover, and both of them died. The question was whether the person who had fired the gunshot from his gun, aiming at both the victims, had the intention to kill or not. Illustration 1. Second, A and B have two children. Both are neighbors. The children enter into a small scuffle. As a result, both the parents start arguing, and in that fit of the moment, A takes out a knife and stabs B, the neighbor. B dies. Illustration 3. A and B, in the same scuffle, the same neighbor's example, enter into an argument. The argument is resolved. The second morning, while B is going to his office, A, along with his accomplice or other 4-5 people, hides behind the bush, armed with deadly weapons. And as soon as B comes on the road, encircles him, circumscribes him, and all 5 of them, inflict bodily injuries. Some inflict injuries with weapons like swords, sticks, others are barehanded. And they inflict injuries just by punching the deceased. Deceased receives multiple injuries, including contusions, including incised injuries, that is sharp cutting object injuries, contusions, and lacerated wounds. Now, in the 3 illustrations which I have given, how do you gather? Right now, I'm not even talking about 299 or 300 culpable homicide amounting to, not amounting to murder. We are only as far as, I'll give you just fourth illustration as well, just to give you an example as to how you gather intention and knowledge. A is aware that there are 5 people in a particular room. He has animosity with only one of them. And he throws a bomb in that particular room. Instead of B, A kills D, who he has no idea about, he's never met him, and he had no intention to kill him. B survives unscratched. Whether in that case, now, in the 4 illustrations I have given you, how do you gather intention and how do you gather knowledge? We are not on the medical evidence. As you said, the question was whether intention can only be gathered from medical evidence. Intention is always gathered from the surrounding circumstances. What has led to a particular act of criminality is where you gather intention from. It is completely deprived, or it is completely independent of medical evidence at the inception. Medical evidence does have a role to play, as I talked about 300 part 30, where the injury is sufficient in the ordinary course of nature to cause death. But before that, what you have to decide is whether the injury which has been caused was caused intentionally or not. So that is always dependent upon the individual overt act of the accused. Medical evidence comes subsequently. I'm right now talking about a very elementary stage because there's so many layers to criminal law that then once you are informed about this, then we can have a better informed discussion regarding evidence as to how you read it, how intention can be gathered from other surrounding circumstances, other circumstantial evidence. But right now we just on the bare discussion upon intention. Now the first example, would anyone like to take up in Nanavati whether that particular person had the intention to cause death or not?
Yes, sir. Sir, this is Devansh.
Hi Devansh, yeah, go ahead.
Sir, in the illustration of the Nanavati case, I would like to say that as he had seen his wife in a compromising position with the deceased, further, he also fired shots by aiming at them, both of them. And also considering the fact that Nanavati in this situation is the same Nanavati of that KM Nanavati case, who was also a naval officer. So the precision with which the shots could be fired and the range and all could be gathered that he had a certain intention to kill them, kill both of them. So that could be gathered.
So according to you, in the Nanavati case, there was clear intention to kill.
Yes, sir.
So whether in that case, it was a case of, you would say that he should be convicted for murder.
No, sir, that is not the thing. But the exception that grave and sudden provocation was applied.
Okay.
That totally turned the tables. That totally turned the tables.
Fair enough. So you mean to say there was intention to kill?
Yes,
but
sir. Absolutely.
But that intention was diluted by the fact that it was overpowered by grave and sudden provocation.
Yes, sir.
Okay. I want everyone to pay attention to what I'm saying now. Once your faculty is taken over by grave and sudden provocation, there is no intention to kill. Understand the distinction. Intention is where you, in your rightful mind, in your conscious mind, want to kill someone. Once your mind is overtaken by grave and sudden provocation, you lose your ability to think. And because you lose your ability to think, then you don't have the intention. You may have the knowledge, but then you would not have the intention to kill. That would be diluted. Why there are exceptions to section 300 is then section 300 part 1, part 2, part 3 or part 4 would not apply. The exceptions would apply. Then the intention to kill is absent because your mental faculties are overtaken or overpowered by grave and sudden provocation or any of the exceptions, right? Free fight, or that you are under a misconception that you are empowered by law. Example was the case of the police officer. Now, as far as the Nanavati case is concerned, I guess you guys, I don't know, got the facts wrong. In Nanavati case, the exception was not applied. The benefit of exception was not given in the Nanavati case. The reason was that in Nanavati case, what happened was that the accused saw the wife and the paramour together. He did not aim at them at that particular moment. He went, he arranged for a firearm. He sat in a movie hall, plotted the plan as to how you want to go about it. He sat in the movie for 3 hours, came out, then again went to the same place, aimed at both the wife as well as the man, the deceased, and then killed them. Then in that case, the Supreme Court said that since it was, and the defense taken was grave and sudden provocation. What was decided was that grave and sudden provocation would apply only when the person in that fit of rage has lost his mental faculty or the ability to think clearly in his mind as to what he wants to do. And that has to be at that particular spur of the moment. The moment you get the time to think, analyze, premeditate, prepare, then that element of grave and sudden provocation is gone. So, case of pure intention is where a particular person knows that I am doing this particular act, and by this particular act, I either want to kill him or that I have intention to cause a particular bodily injury which is otherwise sufficient in the ordinary course of nature to cause death, that is also murder. So then in Nanavati case, if it had been a case where he would have fired the gunshot while he was carrying the gun then and there, and on the spot he sees the wife and the paramour together, in that case the exception would apply. Not when he has the time to think, he has time to prepare, he has time to arrange for a firearm, and then in an orchestrated way he goes and fires the gunshot. I'll give you another example. I'll come to the other illustrations. B, a girl is being raped by A. In that process, B pulls out a knife and stabs the man. Now, whether this is culpable homicide or it is not culpable homicide. Would anyone like to answer this?
Sir,
Hello.
Yeah.
hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, this would not be culpable homicide according to me.
Okay. Why?
Sir,
Private
maybe
defense element.
Okay.
Okay. Hello.
Now, listen to this. Yeah, tell me.
Sir, I have
Anyone
a
else wants-
different answer. I have a different. This
Yeah.
is Nikunj. I have a
Yeah,
different
hi, Nikunj.
answer. Sir, this case will fall under provisos to exception 1 of section 300, where an act is where an act is not murder when it is done in private defense, in self-defense.
Okay.
In self-defense, and that is covered by the general defenses also. So it's not
Okay.
culpable.
Okay. Now, listen to this. What was my question? My question was whether this amounts to culpable homicide. I did not ask whether it amounts to murder or not. The question was whether it amounts to culpable homicide. Do you get the difference? If a particular act is culpable homicide, only then you would see whether it amounts to or not amounts to murder. The question of exception would come only when it is culpable homicide. My question is, and now try to answer me again. When the rape victim or the victim who was being raped or attempted to be raped, if she stabs the assailant or the perpetrator, whether her act of stabbing the assailant amounts to culpable homicide or not. Would anyone like
Hello?
to answer now? Yeah.
It cannot be determined until we know whether or not the assailant had died at that
Oh, he has
spot.
died. He has died. He has died. I'm
Okay, so
sorry.
it would not amount to culpable homicide
Why?
because it was clearly a case of self-defense.
Okay. Now tell me something. Let's have the exception of self-defense in that case. Exception 2. Culpable homicide is not murder if the offender in exercise in good faith or of the right of private defense of the person or property exceeds the power given to him by law and causes the death of the person against whom he exercises such right of defense without premeditation and without any intention of doing more harm than is necessary for the purpose of such defense. What is the language I just read out? Culpable homicide is not murder. Meaning thereby the presumption is it is culpable homicide. It would not amount to murder because it falls under exception 2. It would not be a case of acquittal. Yeah, go ahead, Nipuj.
Sir, a slightly different consideration of Section 100 will come here, or Section 100 of the IPC, where the right to private defense extends to causing death of that person.
Okay.
Where a situation
Good.
has been carved out where an assault, when a person is facing an assault of rape, then the right to private defense extends to causing death of that person, and it specifically is because of Section 100 that that act would not be culpable homicide at all.
Okay. Good answer. I'm happy that you went to Section 100. Now, listen to this. When this particular rape victim or the person who was attempted to be raped, when she uses this particular act, it is culpable homicide. It is not that it is not culpable homicide. It would be culpable homicide because she, in that particular case, has the knowledge. Try and understand. It is a layered answer. I don't know how much you'll appreciate this. But because it is also an exception in terms of Section 100, therefore it would be a case of clean acquittal. But it is not the case, it is not culpable homicide. It is culpable homicide, but not punishable. Now, Section 300, Exception 2 would not come into picture. If you argue Section 300, Exception 2, then in that case, you would be convicted under Section 304, Part 1 or Part 2. Because your act comes under Exception 1, Exception 2, Exception 3, 4 or 5 of Section 300. Here, the act of the girl is culpable. She is intending to cause death. She has knowledge that if she stabs the person, there is every probability that the person would die. But Section 299 and 300 of the IPC are not independent provisions. They are also governed by other general exceptions, because what generally happens, and that is the biggest misconception people have, is that Section 299 and 300 are treated to be a complete code in itself. It is not. Example, Section 86, 87, 88, where somebody is involuntarily intoxicated. Give you an example. Somebody is given a drug in a particular food item. He takes that particular food item and is not in his senses. Involuntary intoxication or involuntary unconscious mind being not being able to make a distinction between what is right and what is wrong. Then in that case, whatever act is done, it is not falling under any of the exceptions of Section 300. Yet, it would not be murder for anything which is done by that particular person who is involuntarily intoxicated. The same would be different when it is a case of voluntary intoxication. I'll give you an example of the latest judgment of the Supreme Court. There, the husband, after getting drunk, throttled the neck of his wife. Multiple injuries found in the body of the woman. Now, the defense taken was that since the wife had fought so much and there was so much of quarrel which had taken place between the husband and wife, the husband drank too much. And therefore, in that particular state of mind where he was too drunk, he throttled the neck of his wife, which caused to the death of the deceased, the wife. The Supreme Court said that it is a case of voluntary intoxication. And in the case of voluntary intoxication, the defense of intoxication cannot be taken. However, there is a rider to this. Even in case of voluntary intoxication, there can be a defense taken to take up a lesser degree of conviction or lesser degree of culpability. That is only dependent upon medical evidence that the person had drank so much that he had lost his senses, he had lost his ability to think, and he had lost his ability to decide what is right and what is wrong to that extent. And that is purely decided, and that is what the Supreme Court said, that there is nothing available on record to decide to what extent that particular person was drunk. And because of that voluntary intoxication, he had lost his ability to think at all. since that particular element was completely absent, the Supreme Court negated this particular defense which was taken. So what I'm trying to say is the exceptions to section 300 are not something which are sacrosanct and which cannot be touched, and you would only look into section 299 and 300. When you are gathering intention, when you're gathering knowledge, you would have to look into the other general exceptions which are available under IPC. I'll give you another example. A mother is being raped. A boy aged about 13 years brings out a gun and shoots that particular assailant. Now, whether in that case it would amount to or it would not amount to murder, or whether it will be at least plain and simple culpable homicide. Here, what would happen in that case is, apart from the exception which are carved out, an act which is done by a minor or an act which is done by an unsound person does not amount to an offense. So a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, when he is doing this particular act, the general exception which is given in the IPC would apply to that case. Even if in that case, it does not fall in one of the exceptions. I'll just tweak the illustration a bit. The boy who was aged about 12 years saw his mother being raped, and after 2 days goes to the house of the assailant and shoots him. In such a case, it does not fall under any of the exceptions of section 300. Whether still that particular act which is done by a 12-year-old boy would amount to murder. Would anyone like to answer this?
Sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, Devansh here.
Yeah,
Sir,
hi Devansh. Yeah.
In the second illustration where the boy went after 2 days to shoot that person, in this case, sir, we'll see about how mental maturity of the child is. That is he or is he aware of the act which he or she is committing? So that would be a case, because a general defense of infancy, I suppose in section 83 of the IPC, is now being regulated by the Juvenile Justice Act as well, which is a special legislation. So according to the Juvenile Justice Act, we have 3 classifications of offences: petty offences, serious offences, and heinous offences. So accordingly, we could assess that according to the mental maturity level. But sir, I have a question regarding the first illustration as well. Sir, if at the instant moment the boy shot the assailant, still then we can't say that it is not a culpable homicide, because if the boy has a mental capacity to understand what rape is, he or he might also have the mental capacity to understand what a gunshot might do to a person.
Okay, so in that case, you're saying that it is a case of murder. What are you trying to imply?
No, not murder, but we can call it culpable homicide as well. Not murder.
You can call it culpable homicide.
Yes, sir.
Tell me something. Yes, if you are applying the general defenses and if you are applying section 100,
yes, sir,
won't this section 100 apply in this case?
So section 100 would definitely apply, because he is also protecting the body and body of the another person as well. Because
then in that case, how is culpable homicide?
I got the point, sir.
You got the point, right? See, I'll come to the point on this. The answers to any of these questions are not easy. You would find contradictory judgments of the Supreme Court. You would find contrary judgments of all the other jurisdictions as well, because everything is dependent upon the attending circumstances. It is not a cut and dry method that if you have a particular formula, you put that particular thing into the formula and you'll get an answer. You would get illustrations where all this has happened, and yet the particular person has been granted benefit of culpable homicide not amounting to murder and has been convicted under section 304 part 1 or 304 part 2. Now, what can be gathered from all this is that intention would be gathered from the acts of that particular person prior to the incident, the act of the person during the incident, and the act of the person after that particular incident has taken place. Now listen to this carefully, because this is how, see, there's an English saying, even the devil need not know what is going inside a person's mind. So intention can never be gathered, because intention is the mental faculty, it's the mensria. So nobody would know what I'm thinking. So my thought process would only be reflected from my actions. And those actions are prior to the incident, during the incident, and after the incident. If that particular act happened at the spur of the moment, where I had no premeditation, no pre-plan, no prior meeting of mind, and had not thought about what is going to happen, I was not prepared for that particular incident. Illustration, that A and B are sitting having drinks together. They're consuming alcohol, voluntary intoxication. Suddenly, on a petty dispute, they start fighting. A takes the beer bottle and hurls it at the head of the other person. The other person dies. Now here, there is no premeditation, no pre-plan, no prior meeting of mind. Both were friends. In such a case, the intention to kill is clearly absent. So intention is negated. The question of knowledge would come in. We'll come to knowledge subsequently. So in this case, it was a case where at the spur of the moment, a particular incident happened. Coming to the illustration where I give you an example where all of them were armed with deadly weapons the next day after the incident, the neighbors, where they were waiting for this particular person to come on the road, and they inflicted injuries. This is a clear case of premeditation, and this is a clear case where that particular person had the intention to cause that particular injury. Hello,
Yes, sir.
I was disconnected, I guess. Am I back?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the second illustration, where I already had the premeditation, pre-plan and prior meeting of mind, which is section 34 of the IPC, that is common intention. Then in that case, the intention is absolutely clear. Now, give you another example. It is not always necessary that you always have to have a pre-plan, that you always have to think, you always have to look for, a plan as to how you want to assault a person. I'll give you an example. There is a scuffle between A and B. Both are unarmed. They're punching each other and they're kicking each other. C, who's the son of B, goes to his house. That's spur of the moment only. He had no pre-plan. And brings out a knife and stabs A. Here, there was no premeditation, no pre-plan. But during that particular incident, you have exceeded your right of private defense. The other person was not armed with any weapon. Even the doctrine of proportionality would not apply, because the threat posed to you was not proportionate to the aggression which you have used. In this case, it is a clear case of murder. I'll give you an illustration of what I argued last week. There were two complete strangers who were standing on a pawn shop, and only on the issue regarding parking of the vehicles, this had a scuffle. The person who had a scuffle called his elder brother. The elder brother just came in a fit of rage. He took out a knife and stabbed that person who had no idea about who he was. Now, once that particular person was stabbed, B, who was there, who had a scuffle with him, started kicking him after he fell on the ground, and blood was oozing out from various parts of his body because he was stabbed brutally by his elder brother, the victim. Now, in this case, despite the fact that B is unarmed, but he is kicking this particular deceased who's stabbed and who's on the floor and who's received multiple stab wounds, the common intention to kill is clear. Here, despite the fact that B is unarmed, but the fact that he's kicking a person who's already received such brutal injuries and he's on the verge of death reflects his intention that the deceased should not remain alive. All the more that if he did not have the common intention of killing this particular person, he would have stopped his elder brother. If not stopping, at least he would not have kicked the person who's on the floor and who's received the stab injuries. So here, common intention to kill comes in. Now, see, these are topics that will require hours to make you guys understand as to how, because there's so subtle distinction between everything. The intention to cause death can be shared by multiple people who are not even armed with a particular weapon. Example, that 5 of us decide that we want to kill A. One is armed with a gun, the other is armed with an axe, third is armed with a sword, fourth is armed with a stick, and fifth person has nothing. He's just driving the car. So the driver of the vehicle takes all other four people to that particular place where the deceased is. Now, whether the driver can take this defense that I was unarmed, I did not touch the deceased, so therefore I did not have the intention to kill. The Supreme Court says, Section 34 of IPC says, no, you had the common intention to kill. There is premeditation, there is pre-plan, there is prior meeting of mind. Therefore, even despite the fact that you've not touched the deceased, you would be convicted under Section 300. Because the other 4 who are armed and you are aware that they're armed and they're going with a particular purpose and you are taking them there, then in that case, you had the common intention to kill. Tweak this illustration. If this particular person reaches that particular place where these 4 people are already armed with weapons and he had no knowledge regarding that, and he just accidentally reaches there, or he receives a phone call from one of them that there is a scuffle, kindly come as soon as possible, and he rushes to the spot subsequently, and there he finds everyone is armed with weapons and he is unarmed. In that case, you can say that no, I did not have the common intention to kill. So what I'm saying is that intention can only be gathered from surrounding circumstances. Now, the example which I gave where the elder brother stabbed the victim. Now, the third one is your intention can also be gathered from the acts which you do after the incident. Example, if I called my elder brother and he, without my exhortation, stabs the deceased, and immediately after he stabs, I take the deceased and rush to the hospital. Now, if that is the case, in the first illustration, I kicked him, I punched him when he was on the ground, had received multiple injuries. But in the subsequent illustration, I tried to stop my brother, and if not stopping my brother, I immediately pick up the deceased and I rush to the hospital. There, the question of intention gets diluted. I'm not saying that he had no intention. That would also again depend on the facts and circumstances. There might be cases where the particular person might kill someone and try to create a defense and say that, oh, I was the person who brought him to the hospital. So there is no hard and fast rule. But these 3 things would have to be taken together. Your acts prior to the incident, your actions during the incident, and your reactions after the incident. So this is how intention is gathered. Is this illustration clear to everyone?
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, so this is Soumya. So I had a small doubt regarding the illustration you just gave about the person who reached there and there were already people armed with weapons. So what if he joins them and not stops them? So doesn't that show his intention?
Good. Yeah. See, if he joins them, exactly. Now, try and understand this one. See, it's such a huge topic. I don't know, we will take hours because I had a lot of material prepared for all of you. But since that we just started discussing, there's so many judgments I had and so many illustrations. But I prefer this one more because I guess this is a more, mind-boggling exercise, and this is how you'd understand. Now, there is, I'll give you an example and then I'll give you answer to what you're saying. So, if this particular person joins the fight, now, first of all, it is not a fight. It is an assault. If it is a case of free fight, I'll give you 2 illustrations to make you understand how intention is gathered. If all these 4 people who were already there on the spot and the 5th person comes subsequently and joins the fight in the sense the assault, he would equally be responsible. It would be a case where he starts sharing the common intention. But in the first illustration, it is an assault. It is not a free fight. But take a second example. Where there is free fight, there are 4 people from one side armed with weapons and 4 people from the other side armed with weapons. And this 5th person comes in and joins the assault. Then in that case, it would be culpable homicide not amounting to murder, or can fall under other exceptions of right of private defense as well. Because there he would see his own people being assaulted. So if he joins that particular fight in order to save his own people, then in that case, he would not be sharing common intention. Just come to this section 300, where there is already an exception. Exception 4, if you would see. Culpable homicide is not murder if it is committed without premeditation in a sudden fight in the heat of passion upon a sudden quarrel, and without the offender having taken undue advantage or acted in cruel or unusual manner. So this 5th person who joins the fight would fall under exception 4, because he did not know that there is a fight which is going on. And so if it is a case of free fight between 2 groups, in that case, the person would be only responsible for his own individual act. Can understand this. Common intention, section 34, even if you don't give the fatal blow, even if you are unarmed, or you are carrying a very small weapon, let's say if it is a gunfight, and you are holding a lathi or a stick, and you only inflict simple injuries on the body of the deceased, still you would be convicted for murder under section 300, read with section 34 of the IPC. But if it is a case of free fight, where the illustration I had given, 2 neighbors, one after another, family members start coming in, carrying weapons, and join the fight. It started with 2 people, ends up in a fight of 16 people, 18 people. Let's say NLI is getting famous for it for batch fights. I came to know about that. Let's say it's a batch fight. Now, in that case, everyone who's seeing his batchmate being thrashed joins the party. Now, in that case, whether it would be a case of common intention, or it would be a case of right of private defense of property and person. So, in such cases where you see the people you want to protect are being thrashed or are in a scuffle, where you either trying to protect people or trying to inflict injuries, their common intention would not come in. There, you would be responsible for your individual overt act. Now, there are 2 principles which circumscribe this. One is doctrine of proportionality. Let's say this, that A slaps B and B in return shoots him. This is no right of private defense of property and person. Why? Because this is grossly disproportionate. This is violative of the doctrine of proportionality, because it was not proportionate to the threat which was posed by the person who slapped you. Similarly, let's say an example of a batch fight where there is only a scuffle and there is an assault, physical assault, where nobody is armed with any weapon. Now, in that case, somebody who just jumps up from the hostel and brings in an iron rod and starts inflicting injuries, there he is exceeding his right of private defense. Then in that case, he has that intention. And apart from the mob who's fighting in a batch fight, the person who's holding that rod would be individually responsible for the injuries which he inflicts on any of the bodies of the other batchmates. So the question of intention would always be in relation to the threat posed, in relation to what the acts you done prior to the incident. Let's say that one night prior to everything, one complete batch decides to take revenge or to teach somebody a lesson. In that case, it is premeditation. So if there are 20 people and only 10 assault and 10 people just stay behind, but if you're part of that mob, then 147, 148, 149, unlawful assembly. Then in that case, you are responsible. We would have to hold a separate lecture for making a distinction between common object and common intention. Common object and common intention is huge difference between the two. Common intention is premeditation, pre-plan and prior meeting of mind, where you decide to do a particular thing. But common object is something which you can gather in the spur of the moment. You don't need premeditation for it. So in all these batch fights, it would be a case where you can be convicted in terms of section 147, 148, 149. So it would not be a case of common intention, but it would be a case of common object. All of you have the same object of teaching the other batch a lesson. So you have the same common objective. So then in that case, you can be convicted for the proportionate crime you've committed. Let's say nobody dies, but you inflict injuries, fractures, you open up heads. In that case, it would be a case under section 326. It can be a case under 307, attempt to murder. It can be a case of grievous hurt, coupled with the common object under 147, 148, 149. So as far as the intention part is concerned, the intention would always be gathered from this. Now the knowledge part, it is a lesser degree of consciousness. See, what is intention and knowledge? Intention and knowledge are nothing but the conscious level of you understanding and your faculties understanding the consequences of your action. Intention is the highest degree where you intend to do a particular thing. Knowledge is the conscious awareness of the consequences of your action. So the illustration where I had given, where the police officer fires a particular gunshot in the public, then in that case, it would not be culpable homicide amounting to murder. It would be culpable homicide not amounting to murder, and he would be convicted under 304 part 2. Because he does not have the specific intention of causing injury to a particular person. He's not aiming at anyone. He's not trying to kill anyone. He's trying to disperse the mob. But then he would be attributed that particular knowledge that his act is so inherently dangerous. Now, it can be argued, now this is contentious, that whether it falls under 304 part 2, that is culpable homicide not amounting to murder and under the category of knowledge, or 304 part A, that is rash and negligent act. In some cases, it has been held that it will be rash and negligent act. In the case of Salman Khan, as everyone is aware, he was convicted under 304A, rash and negligent act. But the lower courts had convicted him under section 304, not 304A. Why? Because he was attributed that special knowledge regarding the fact that not only was he intoxicated, voluntary intoxication, but the way he was driving his vehicle and the place he was driving his vehicle was so inherently dangerous that it would have caused, in all likelihood would have caused death. So there, the argument was also taken. Nobody argued that it was murder. Nobody argued that. Everyone argued that either it is a case under section 304 or it is a case under section 304A. So I guess as far as these illustrations are concerned, we can keep talking about these illustrations one after another. Everything boils down to your acts and omissions during, prior, during, and after the incident. Anyone has questions on this? Because I guess we can go on and on this. I had plans of actually having an orchestrated way of dealing with this theoretically, but I guess we can have more discussion on this. Anyone has any other questions on this? Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
So you gave us the illustration about a person, a police.
Nipunj, I'll just interrupt. See, I've taken a lot of illustrations. I just started off. I guess we've not even discussed 299, 300 threadbare, and we've not taken up.
So a question regarding that then.
Yeah, no. You can come up with questions. I was just giving you a rider. You can continue after this. Only thing I'm saying is that this would take time, and only thing I'm saying is that if there is anything which I have started and I have not clarified. So if there is some question regarding any of the illustrations which I have given, where I have not given a satisfactory answer to that, first let's take them and then we can take fresh questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, the question, the illustration in which you pointed out that the police personnel loaded an actual bullet in his rifle and shot. So it is clear that he did not have the intention to kill a particular person, but it can be argued that he had the intention to kill. Like you can get a similar example from the halwa case, the famous halwa case, where a person was trying to feed poisoned halwa to someone and accidentally
No, fair enough. Nipunj, I'll just interrupt you in between.
Yeah.
See, this particular action of the police officer, you would have to read exception 3 for it. I'll just read it for you. Culpable homicide is not murder if the offender, being a public servant or aiding a public servant action, acting for advancement of public justice, exceeds the power given to him by law. You understood what I'm saying?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Exceeds the power. So the illustration of halwa does not apply here. Here, the police officer has been given bullets by law. Now he does a misjudgment of not using rubber bullets and uses actual bullets, which are also given by law. And he is empowered to use his licensed revolver and his authorized revolver for it. Only thing which he is doing is he is exceeding the power given to him by law.
Yes.
Then in that case, it falls under exception 3. It is not murder. It is culpable homicide not amounting to murder. So maximum he can be punished is under section 304 part 2. Is this clear? Is this clear?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
Any other question?
Sir, I had another related question to another topic. Sir, you have touched this. So when you were discussing the hostel fight thing, so there are people who are knowledgeable in law, and they clearly know what falls under which category, whether it will be a clear case of culpable homicide or murder or not anything. So if such a person commits an act which is murder but covers the tracks so clearly that he cannot be convicted of anything, what is done in such cases that would fall in the practicality aspect of these things?
The practical life is completely different from what you've actually stated right now. See how it is done, how intention is gathered. Nobody who actually does that particular incident or the person who has knowledge of law would say, though I did it, therefore I did not have intention, I did not have knowledge. The intention is and knowledge is gathered from the facts itself. Now, where do you get the facts from? You get the facts from witnesses. Now, if the so-called person who has great knowledge of law, if he had hatched the conspiracy and one day prior to the incident, he instigated everyone. But at the time of the incident, he did not come at the forefront. But he was the mastermind. Now, the prosecution witnesses would come forward and say that one day prior to the incident at 12 in the night in the hostel, Mr. X was the person who instigated everyone and he was the person who has the conspiracy. So then Mr. X, despite being so knowledgeable, would be convicted for murder, read with criminal conspiracy under section 120B. So the person who hatches the conspiracy, and it's a good illustration. Now, I can hatch the conspiracy and I can sit in my house and not be at the scene of incident at all. I can bribe people, the so-called Supari killings, which we hear, the underworld killings. Now, Dawood Ibrahim did not actually put everything on fire. He was not the person who actually, undertook the blast in the 1993 Mumbai blast. He was not physically present anywhere. But he is equally responsible. He is equally charged, if not more. In fact, he has graver offenses against him. Because criminal conspiracy is a charge, 120B is a charge which would apply to the person who is there at the time of preparation and at the time of hatching of the conspiracy. So, criminal law would not spare anyone who has the intention and his intention is proved. And intention can only be proved, as I said. So, the witnesses would have to come forward. See, the thing is, despite everyone doing everything, if the witnesses don't come forward and say, no, sir, he was not present there. Oh, no, sir, he was not the person who had actually fired the gunshot. Whereas he's the person who fired the gunshot. You see, it's a completely filmy story where everyone, you win over the witnesses. So intention would only be gathered from ocular evidence and the medical evidence. If the ocular evidence does not state any overt act against you, if the FIR does not state anything against you, if the interrogatory statements under 161 of the CRPC don't state anything against you, then mere on bald allegations, you cannot say that a particular person had the intention or the knowledge, had the actus reus and the mens rea to cause a particular or to commit a particular offense. Right? Yeah. Any other question? Because we would have to wrap it up. I have some preoccupation after this.
5 minutes.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
Sir.
Good afternoon. Yeah.
Srijan this side.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. I wanted to know what is the difference between knowledge and intention. Because, sir, see, like if X fires at someone and he has this knowledge that if he fires at Y, he might cause death of Y, and even then with this knowledge he fires at Y, won't that amount to intention?
See, the moment he is aiming at Y, okay, yeah. The moment he is aiming at Y, he does not have the knowledge, he has the intention. The moment he is aiming at Y. Now, I'll give you an illustration, the knowledge, how it is different from this. This is the latest judgment of the Supreme Court. You guys must have heard about this, which is happening everywhere around Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. All these marriage processions which happen, people fire gunshots in air. There, what happened in one of the marriage processions, 5 people died because of pellet wounds. And all of them were part of the marriage procession. Now, the question which came in is the trial court as well as the high court convicted that particular person who was the father of the groom for murder, saying you had the intention to kill. The Supreme Court overturned it by saying that he did not have that particular intention to kill because he had nothing against these people who died. He had fired the gunshot in air and the people who were part of the marriage procession received pellet wounds. But he was attributed knowledge that the act was so inherently and eminently dangerous that if I'm firing the gunshot and there are pellets which come out of that particular bullet, a country-made gun, that is, I have to have knowledge regarding the fact that that would cause a particular bodily injury which is sufficient in the ordinary course of nature to cause death. So there, knowledge was attributed to that particular person. See, the distinction between intention and knowledge is only of the degree. The higher the degree of consciousness, the closer you are to the intention. The lesser the degree of consciousness, the more close you are to knowledge. So, knowledge can be of 2 types. Special knowledge, example, that knowledge of a doctor, or knowledge of a prudent ordinary person. That any person, example, I cannot say that, oh, you know, I just gave an axe blow on somebody's head and that was an accidental injury. And I will say, oh, I was not aware that he would die. You cannot say that. But if it is something where it is not an act of a prudent man, as I had given an example of a weak heart or somebody who's suffering from some specific ailment, there, what would happen in that case is, unless and until I have that special knowledge, the intention cannot be attributed to me. It can at best be a case of knowledge, can never be a case of intention. So, a thumb rule in intention is that I have to have that intention of causing that particular bodily injury. At least that should be my intention. If I don't have that intention of causing that particular bodily injury as well, then it is not a case of intention. Yeah, anything else?
Yeah, got it. So, an additional question that I have is, sir, if an act amounts to murder, then that act has to necessarily amount to culpable homicide?
Absolutely.
Or,
see,
sir,
no. They can never. See, culpable homicide is the genus, murder is the species. All murders are culpable homicides, but all culpable homicides are not murder. So the first step is that whenever a particular person has to be tried for murder, it necessarily has to be culpable homicide. It can never be the case that a particular act is murder, but it is not culpable homicide. Every act of murder has to be culpable homicide. But every act of culpable homicide may not amount to murder. When it would not amount to murder? When either the exceptions curled out under section 300 are attracted, or any of the other general exceptions which are curled out apply. Just one thing, somebody had made a mention regarding the Juvenile Justice Act and also in context of section 83, 84, 85, 86, 87. See, Juvenile Justice Act is a procedural code. It's not a substantive law. So it does not determine the question of intention or knowledge. It is still determined by the IPC. So don't get confused between procedural laws and substantive laws. If you would actually see example of that 12-year-old boy firing a gunshot on the second day, it would be covered by section 83. act of child above 7 years and under 12 years of immature understanding. Nothing is an offense which is done by a child above 7 years of age and under 12 who has not attained sufficient maturity of understanding to judge of the nature and consequences of his conduct on that particular occasion. Now, how do you judge maturity? And how do you judge whether a particular person has attained sufficient maturity? See, now the distinction here. Alam sir might have told you Vardharajan versus state of Kerala or Karnataka, 65 Supreme Court, where, college going girl, this girl, that must have been taught to all of you. That particular principle does not apply. See, the question, as far as criminal law is concerned, it is always interpreted strictly. It is not a beneficial legislation. So criminal law would always be interpreted to give benefit of doubt to the accused. So what language has been employed in section 83 would not be given an extended meaning to say that no, he had sufficient maturity of understanding to judge his actions. He is squarely covered by section 83. The prosecution would have to come forward and would have to discharge its onerous burden beyond reasonable doubt to wriggle itself out from section 83. Otherwise, the presumption is a 12-year-old boy commits an act is not an offense. Cannot be an offense. So be it Juvenile Justice Act, be it any other special act, it would not override these principles of criminal law. Just one thing. I'll conclude my lecture on this particular topic. We can go on and on, but there's so much which I had to cover, but I guess time is not enough for all this. Example, A wants to kill B and fires a gunshot, but instead kills C. And B is unscratched, unharmed. What is this? Whether it is murder. Would anyone like to answer this? Hello?
Good evening, sir. This is Ronak.
Yeah, Ronak.
Sir, I believe that this would not amount to murder as there was no intention to kill that individual.
Okay. Now, this amounts to murder. Now, there is some concept of transfer of malice in criminal law. And that is section 301 of IPC. That is not under section 300. That is under section 301. Culpable homicide by causing death of person other than person whose death was intended. Now, what it means is, in English law, it is called transfer of malice. I had the intention to kill. I wanted to kill. I aimed at that particular person. But instead of that person, somebody else died. Won't I be punished for having that intention of killing somebody? And I did kill somebody, not the same person. So that is called transfer of malice. So it does amount to murder under section 301 of IPC. The only reason I'm saying all this is there is no cut and dry method. Whatever I'm telling you are illustrations. It is just the exercise. What you need to understand is whenever you are trying to make a distinction between culpable homicide amounting to or not amounting to murder, you should know the steps. If you calculate your steps properly, you would always reach the correct conclusion. And whether the person had the intention or the knowledge would always be on the attending circumstances. As I said, prior, during, and subsequent to the incident. The threat posed and whether your actions are proportionate to it. When you're saying that one of the exceptions apply, whether those exceptions in the literal sense of the word apply or not. Now, just one more thing. The principle of criminal law is that the prosecution would prove the guilt of the person beyond reasonable doubt. But the same is not the case when you're taking up your defense. Your defense is only on preponderance of probability in terms of section 105 of the Evidence Act. So it is not that you have to prove your defense beyond reasonable doubt. That is, I don't have to prove that the assault or the aggression which I have used was actually proportionate to the threat which was posed. I'll give you an illustration. There is a fight between A and B. Both are not carrying any weapon. But B sees that A has a knife in his pocket. And during the scuffle, A just puts his hand in his pocket. In retaliation, B pulls out a gun from his pocket and fires. Here, though A had not used that particular knife, but since B had that reasonable apprehension that A might use the knife against him, he fired the gunshot and killed A. In this case, it would not be culpable homicide amounting to murder. It would be culpable homicide, but it would be covered by one of the exceptions. So then in that case, he would be convicted under 304 part 1 or part 2, but not under 302. So therefore, what only thing I'm trying to make you guys understand is that these are only the steps to determine or to judge the actions of a particular accused. Which category he would eventually fall into would depend on all the facts and circumstances, all the attending circumstances which might either be in favor of the accused or might be against the accused. So this, and coupled with the medical evidence, the doctors as to what exactly the postmortem, what is the postmortem report, what is the autopsy report, what is the DNA report, what are the forensic lab reports. All these come together. See, example, I'm only talking about intention and knowledge because right now we're only talking about cases where you have witnesses to the incident. In cases of circumstantial evidence, in cases of blind murders, there only the circumstantial evidence is taken into account. Recoveries, DNA reports, forensic lab reports, only ballistic expert reports, a particular gun, whether it was fired or not, the bullet which was recovered, whether it was fired from that particular gun or not, what was the distance, what was the injury caused. Example, one of the witnesses says that, oh, the bullet was fired from 10 feet. And actually the nature of the injury of the bullet is such that maximum it could have been caused by from a distance of 1 feet because there is blackening and charring in the injury which is sustained by the deceased. So the witness testimonies stand falsified. So even in those cases where you have eyewitnesses to the incident, because it is contrary to medical evidence, those witnesses are falsified. So all this argument and hoopla about intention, knowledge goes into the dustbin. So all I'm trying to tell you is that the approach towards a particular provision, how you read it, I would expect all of you now to read section 200, 299, 300, 301 and all the exceptions to section 300 along with the illustrations. It would give you a far clearer picture regarding what exactly is intention and knowledge. And after you've read section 299, 300, because if you read it now, there will be, you would appreciate it better after this discussion. Then read section 34 of IPC, read 120B of IPC, 147, 148, 149. That's it. And if you have time, you can also go to the general exceptions which are there, section 82, 83, 84, 85 up till section 100. So this would give you a clear picture regarding what are the exceptions carved out in the IPC, what is 299, 300, the illustrations, culpable homicide amounting to, not amounting to murder, when it falls under general exceptions under section, from section 82, 83 onwards, and when it will fall under exceptions carved out under section 300 of IPC. So in such a way, you can go ahead with your autopsy of whether it is culpable homicide amounting to or not amounting to murder. Can we put this to rest now? I have to go somewhere.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. So any participant has any further doubts? Sir is now wrapping up the session. I think no one. So, on behalf of all the participants and NCM, thank you for taking out your time and providing us with this learning opportunity. We really hope that we can have more of such sessions with you and that we can have further on different topics so that the students can learn the practical aspects of law. Like this session was really an interactive one and it would really benefit your juniors at NLIU if you could take out your time in future sometime and we can have the honor to host you again.
I'll just put in one word of advice to everyone. See, what we learn in law schools is something which, to be very honest, see, it does work in our favor when we come out in the real life and obviously the practical life. But I guess all of us lack the approach. What all of us need to understand is that just by reading something, mugging it up and puking it out, we don't remember anything. I don't remember anything I read in law school as far as the procedural part is concerned, the substantive part is concerned. So all I'm trying to say is when you're there doing your internships, when you are reading a particular provision, try to understand the practical aspect of it as to how it is actually done. And for that, internships, I guess, are the best mediums. When you're doing your internships, see that the theoretical part of what you've already read, how it is actually put to use, because only then you will understand the real interpretation of that particular provision. And one last thing, keep reading the provisions again and again. Today, before this, I read section 299 300 at least 10 times. And I got a different perspective about 299 300, though personally, I might have handled more than 1,000 murder cases. But every time I read the provision, I have a new interpretation and new understanding of what exactly the provision is about. So all I would request all of you is that never leave the love for the bare acts. Keep reading the provisions again and again, the illustrations again and again. It would always give you a new perspective about the language used in that particular provision. And when I'm saying this, I'm not saying this for IPC, I'm saying for any other provision. It can be, it can be Companies Act, it can be Constitution Law, it can be Arbitration Act, it can be Competition Act, it can be anything. But your love for the bare act and the interpretation of the provisions, and you should always have the scheme of the act in mind. Where I would find a particular chapter, what is the scheme of the enactment, whether it is a beneficial legislation, whether it is a penal legislation, whether it has to be interpreted liberally, whether it has to be interpreted strictly. These are the tools which you would have to keep using, and only then you would come to a correct interpretation of a particular provision. And don't jump to conclusion just by reading a particular provision of that particular enactment. Example, don't read to conclusion regarding 299 300 without understanding the general defenses as well. So all I would say is that the practical life is completely different from what we do in law school. At times it also handicaps us because we come up with some preconditioned notions, and we also come to the practical life with conditioning, which actually deters our growth. So all I would say is that keep reading and try to stay connected with the practical side of law as well, because that would really help you, be it in law school, be it in law firms, be it in courts, be any other place. Understanding the practical implication and application of law is very important. Only then you'll be able to have an holistic approach towards how to go about things, right? Best of luck to everyone. It was indeed a pleasure, and I would like to come back whenever you guys need me. Though the good thing is that COVID has given us a lot of time. Otherwise, it gets difficult for us to have such kind of interactions with people. But next time I'm there in the campus for some any reason, it'd be good to have a face-to-face conversation. Unfortunately, right now I've just been staring at the blank screen right now, not even knowing who am I speaking to. So, but anyways, at least I get to hear you guys as well. So it'll be good to catch up. If you guys are anytime around in MP, Jabalpur, Indore, Bhopal, we keep working. I have offices everywhere. It'll be good to catch up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir.